Good morning. In the first lecture that I did, I cast a very broad sweep looking at the idea of civil society and the importance of civil society in opposing and confronting and overthrowing authoritarian and totalitarian states. And in the second lecture, we drilled down a little deeper into one particular institution of civil society, which is the union, and looked at the role that it did. And now in the third lecture, I would like to drill down even further and actually look at the experiences that American labor movement has in terms of providing international solidarity to unions fighting for democratization. And so I want to begin this section with a personal story. It's a story that happened the week after Thanksgiving in 29. And I found myself in an apartment in Havana, sitting next to a representative from the Polish union Solidarność. We had been invited to come to Cuba by an independent teachers union in Cuba that was holding a conference. And of course, the Cuban government didn't want us there. The American government has some peculiar rules about traveling to Cuba, so I managed to find my way to Cuba with the approval of neither the American government nor the Cuban government. And we found our way to this particular apartment. On the approach to the apartment, we discovered some obvious political police and some not so obvious political police watching. And when we went in, we met a number of the people who were involved in the Colegio, this Cuban independent teachers union. And they began to tell us the story of this conference that they were having, and that, in fact, the people who were still there were a small number of who had originally assembled, and that the day before, the state security had come and told them that this was an illegal counter-revolutionary gathering, and that if they didn't break it up, they would all be taken to prison. And so most of the people had left, and the people who were still there were people who had basically nothing left to lose, people who had already lost their employment, a woman who had cancer in her leg and was having difficulty getting medical treatment from the Cuban health system, which they tell us is the best in the world. And there was a whole series of people who were telling us their stories who were very sad and very plaintive stories about what had happened to them in Cuba as a result of their attempts to organize an independent union. And suddenly there was a commotion at the front of the apartment, and the man who was the head of the union, whose apartment it was, Roberto, told us all to be quiet, and he and his wife rushed to the front of the apartment where state security had broken in again. And what began then was a heated argument between them and state security. And in particular, state security was after a fellow who in Cuba would be known as an independent journalist who reported on such events. And they had followed him there. And they were going to take him away, and they were going to take everybody away. And it was an incredible scene to actually be part of. The Cuban teachers were crying. There was one teacher who had a daughter with her because she hadn't been able to find someone to look after her, and they were trying to hide her. So if the state security came in, they couldn't break up and take her away from her family. And this went on for some time. And Roberto's wife is a tiny little woman. She doesn't even come up to this on me, and she was staring down these state security. You're not going to take anybody away, you know. And eventually they left, having made their point. And when they left, it was the end, of course, what was going to happen. But before we left ourselves, both the representative of Solidarnosc and I gave some few words to the people who were there. And I said to them that for the American Federation of Teachers, which I represented, that solidarity is not something which is that ends at the border of the United States. That we believe that there is importance for solidarity particularly with teachers and educators all around the world, with unionists all around the world. And that's why we came, and that's why I came, much to the displeasure of my wife the night before I left, who wanted to know why I had to keep on going to places like Cuba and China. But it was what we did, and why that was important. And so I think, you know, there's a little history which I will talk about how we got to that place, how we got to that understanding. The teachers' unions in the United States were started in the early 1900s, and they were, like most unions of the left. The people who organized unions were socialists of various sorts. But what happened in the 1920s and 1930s after the Russian Revolution was that there began to develop divisions between people who were on a democratic left and people who were on an authoritarian left. And within the American Federation of Teachers, there were some ferocious battles that were fought in the 1930s and the 1940s over whether or not our unions were going to be unions that were controlled and dominated by communists, or whether they would be unions that were reflected the membership. And in particular, a series of events happened in the late 1930s, beginning with the Moscow trials, in which not only did the Soviet Union put on trial virtually everybody in the leadership of the Bolshevik Revolution who was still alive in Stalin's purge of the party, but offered the most incredible and unbelievable explanations for why they were doing that. And the American Communist Party mimicked them at every turn, and actually used their folks in the teacher union movement to defend the Moscow trials. And then there was the assassination of Trotsky. There was the Hitler-Stalin pact. And at each turn, the communists in the teacher movement defended the Soviet Union, and had in those parts of the union movement under their control, including some locals in the AFT, and even for a time the AFT national leadership, had them actually advocating for an authoritarian government that was engaged in mass murder of its own citizens. And so those battles were ferocious battles. They involved not only rank and file teacher unionists, but they involved some of the most important intellectuals in American political life who were part of the teacher union movement. People like John Dewey, people like Reinhold Niebuhr, people like George Counts. All of them were involved in those battles. And by 1940, the communists had been expelled from the American Federation of Teachers, long before what would happen in McCarthyism in the United States in a later period. And out of that came a commitment on the part of the American Federation of Teachers, an understanding that it was an essential part of who we were as a union, that we would be committed to democracy promotion and democracy development throughout the whole globe. And so for a period of time when the international trade union movement was divided between communist-controlled unions and free unions, we were, of course, part of the free union movement. But more importantly, in the period that began in the late 60s, as opposition movements began to develop in the Soviet bloc, as you see things like the Prague Spring, which is violently suppressed by a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, as you see the development of Solidarność in Poland in 1980. In all of those events, the American Federation of Teachers, and at that time, the broader American labor movement, the AFL-CIO, were involved in giving material aid and support, not just political support, but material aid and support to democracy movements, and in particular to democratic unions in those areas. And as we developed through the late 80s into the 90s, the union also played a role in terms of giving support to the free multiracial unions in South Africa, in terms of giving support to teachers' unions in places like Chile and Brazil and Argentina and throughout Latin America. And so that was a very important part of our identity. Yes?
شما هم عرض کردید که این اتحادیه مدرسان امریکایی در کشورهای مانند آفریقای جنوبی، مانند چیله، حمایت مالی یا در واقع حمایت مادی ارائه کرد به اتحادیه‌های مدرسان که تو این کشورها فعال بودن. سوالم اینه که این حمایت چه شکلی می‌گرفت و تا چه حدی مربوط به شرایط موجود در اون کشورها بود؟
So it would depend upon what the needs were, but some of it was simply smuggling is perhaps not too inelegant a word, smuggling money inside that unions could then use for various sorts of organizing tasks that they need. Certainly providing ways for unions to have access outside of Eastern Europe or outside of South Africa to forums where they could make a case about what was happening in their countries and what needed to happen. So providing that level of support. Having a position that it was absolutely essential in all of those cases that American labor unions would only recognize free and independent unions in those countries and not government-controlled unions. So it probably took a range of those things. At some points, as things began to open up, we would even go and hold events, inside Poland or inside East Germany. And certainly, South Africa was a particular conundrum because it in some ways it was fairly easy for white people to travel in and around South Africa, but it was a whole different story for people of color.
سوالم بیشتر در مورد سوال نیست، درخواستی که یه مقدار بیشتر در مورد اهداف و ساختار دو اتحادیه صحبت کنید. منظورم اتحادیه که تحت کنترل اتحاد جماهیر شوروی بود و اتحادیه که مستقل بود و اتحادیه معلمان آمریکا هم جزوش بود. در این خصوص صحبت بکنید.
So what happened in the United States was that the original union locals in the United States were small locals. It was not until 1960 that any teacher union actually won collective bargaining. And so what you think of as teacher unions today, where they represent all of the educators in a particular school system or particular university system, that wasn't true then. What happened then is that there would be a local in New York City that would have members from many different schools and universities and even different cities, like, you know, close to New York City. And so in many ways, because there wasn't yet collective bargaining for teachers, and it took some time to win that, because the legislation in the United States that kind of set it in place for private sector employees, like auto workers and steel workers, specifically excluded public sector employees, and almost all of the teachers are public education teachers in the United States. So that doesn't happen until a good 40 years after the private sector was to organize. So you have unions that are, the people belong to them almost more out of a commitment to the idea of solidarity than because it's a union that's actually engaged in bargaining. They do advocate for teachers, but they obviously don't have the same degree of influence. And so that's a problem, because you don't have the full spectrum of your teachers, and a small organized political party, the American Communist Party, even at its height, never even had 100,000 members, but it was small and it was disciplined. The smaller the pond that they played in, the bigger fish that they were, and the more influence they could have. And so they also would engage in tactics which would basically wear out and alienate other people. So they would, you know, meetings would be carried on till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when people had to get up at 6 o'clock to go teach their classes. And so what happened was that communists began to control some local unions. All right. And New York City, which was the biggest teacher union local, was a place where this battle was particularly fought out. And what eventually happened in New York City was that because they were unable to deal with the communists in the main teacher union local, the non-communists went and set up their own independent union. And a battle was then fought over which union was going to be recognized by the American Federation of Teachers. And that was a battle that, you know, went on, I think, for a good 3 or 4 years. But all of those events that I talked about, they play a real pivotal role in this, because because of the nature of teacher unionism, a lot of the debate is over things like the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and what does that mean? How could the Soviet Union be a progressive country and enter into an alliance with the world's leading racist, and so it was over those issues that eventually the break was made, and the communists were expelled from the American Federation of Teachers.
What about international?
So internationally, what happens is that the communists originally set up their own, what they call a Red International, which is just communist unions, which is not a problem for everybody else because they're off by themselves. But then they decide this is not the most productive way for them, and they enter the main unions and they try to take over the main unions. So by the late 1940s, there's a battle internationally about are you going to have communist-controlled international union federations? And in particular, the battle is over whether a union of teachers in the Soviet Union is a real union, or if it's just a government agency. All right, and so that battle is fought, and there is a split, and you end up with one international federation, which is basically controlled by the communist parties, not only those in Soviet Union, but in other countries like France, where a communist party might control the union, and another international federation, which are all free and independent unions. And those two exist until the fall of the Soviet Union. It's only after the fall of the Soviet Union that's overcome. It's a long and complicated history, but
I think it's very important. Unfortunately, in Iran or place like Iran, most of not activist ideology call people. They feel that they own like union syndicats because it's belong to left spectrum, and that's why it's still we do not see any positive development despite there's that's why I asked to explain more because
so I think it's true in the American context that people who become active in unions are generally on the left, but there is a real difference between people who see themselves as part of a democratic left and people who see themselves involved in some authoritarian left-wing project, and that's basically the division that occurs in the AFT. There's not conservatives or right-wingers battling it out in the union movement. It's between people on the left who are committed to a democratic political philosophy and who believe that unions should reflect their membership and not be the tools of a political party, and those who want to make unions into tools of a kind of authoritarian political party.
What about the participation of women in the entire union, not just AFT?
That's an interesting question because it's certainly the case in America, and I think many other countries, that there are professions which are more dominated by women than others. And so it's been the history of teaching and nursing in the United States, for example, that they've been female-dominated professions, and particularly the lower down you go, pre-K elementary school, you see very few men, and so and there's some consequences for that. So there is a school of thought, I think, which has some compelling power behind it, that one of the reasons why doctors and lawyers are much more respected and much better compensated, etc., is that in the United States those are male-dominated professions. And the reason why teaching and nursing have always, not had that same sort of respect is because they are female-dominated. Now, I would say to you that in the history of teacher unionism, it's still a battle to see that women are properly represented. You would think that in a profession that is predominantly female, that the union leadership would reflect that. So I have to tell you that in the early years, it's still a predominantly male leadership. There are women who are in the leadership, but not at all reflecting, their proportion in the ranks. But I would say, that's no longer the case, and certainly since the 1960s and the modern feminist movement in the United States, there are very many women in the leadership of the teachers union movement. That the president of the AFT is a woman now.
دوست دارم در خصوص کلاً خواسته ها یا اون دستاورده های دو تا اتحادیه، اونایی که کمونیست بودن، نه آمریکا، به طور کلی تو دنیا، چه اونها و اونهایی که مستقل بودن و متعلق بودن به کشورهای آزاد یا بیان دنیای آزاد. میخوام ببینم که چقدر اون دستاوردهای اونها تو کشورهایشون عملی میشد. مثلا اگر اتحادیه معلمان آمریکا حداقل دستمزد رو تحمیل میکرد به دولت که اینقدر به معلمان باید پرداخت میشد، و میخوام دقیقاً همین رو تو دنیای کمونیستا ببینم. یعنی تو اتحاد جماهیر شوروی اگر یه قانونی دولت تصویب میکرد که در مورد معلمان یا کارگرا یه امتیازی داده بود، آیا عمل میکرد یا فقط تبلیغات بود؟
In the United States, the big thrust of unions, teacher unions, who were really marginal up until 1960s, the big thrust was to win collective bargaining. And once they won collective bargaining, the first real win is in New York City in 1963. Once they do that, there's a space of about 10 years where virtually the whole country becomes organized with collective bargaining. And so today, the teachers' unions are really the only unions left in the United States that have their industry organized, where in most states, aside from states that have laws prohibiting it, teachers belong to the union. And once they have collective bargaining, they battle for certainly for wages, increasing salaries. They battle for working conditions. Pensions is a real important piece because there was always a kind of implicit contract that teachers wouldn't get paid as much, but they would have steady work. They wouldn't get laid off in bad economic times, and they would have a good pension. And then the other thing that teacher unions have fought for, and this goes back to before collective bargaining, is academic freedom. So there have always been efforts, by government to punish or restrict the freedom of teachers in terms of their teaching. There was, for example, during World War I, teachers were being fired if they opposed the war. It didn't even have anything to do with their teaching in the classroom. If they didn't support the war, they would be fired. So that was an important issue. Now, the thing that's interesting about the unions in communist countries is that people don't even necessarily, they don't have a career path where they work their way up from being a teacher to being, a local leader to. What happens is that you look at China, for example, the union people are actually, they're lateral transfers. So you have a whole career in the Communist Party, and then at age 50, they move you over to head a union, which tells you something about what that position is, and it obviously doesn't require any knowledge of what is going on or what's happening. And they are basically, they follow this Leninist idea that unions are transmission belts that take the party's ideology and the party's politics and deliver it to the ordinary teacher or ordinary worker. So they don't really, there's not really any battle over wages or working conditions. It's interesting in China because a little space has developed around that they seem to be allowing unions to negotiate if the employer is a foreign corporation. If it's Chinese, that's a different matter, but there seems to be a little space opening up around foreign employers now.
ما حالا چه در امریکا، چه در ایران، چه در کشورهای دیگه می‌بینیم که گروه‌های بسیاری هستن که با اتحادیه‌ها مخالفت می‌کنن، مقاومت می‌کنن. یا میگن که اینا دشمنان رشد اقتصادی هستن، یا اینا وابسته به دولت خارجی هستن، حالا شوروی باشه، هر کشور دیگه باشه. سوال من اینه که در تجربه اتحادیه امریکایی وقتی با این گروه ها مواجه شدن چگونه سعی کردن اینا رو حالا قانع بکنن، تقریب بکنن که باشون مخالفت نکنن یا بالاخره حتی ازشون حمایت بکنن؟ یعنی چگونه پیامشون رو رسوندن به این گروه ها و چگونه راضیشون کردن که در واقع یا همکاری بکنن یا جلوی تلاشاشون یعنی نایستن؟
So there are some just fundamental conflicts that there is no negotiation of. So there are people ideologically far to the conservative side of the spectrum who don't believe that there should be unions. They don't believe that working people should be able to combine and bargain collectively and use collective action. They think that each individual worker should have to negotiate their wages and working conditions, and so there's not really much conversation to be had there. There's also a complication around American politics. For the longest time, American politics were not ideological in the sense that you would find in European countries or in other countries where you had parties of the left and parties of the right. And so they would be mixed, they would be mixture. So, for example, the Democratic Party had a lot of liberals and progressives, but in the southern part of the United States, it had segregationists and racists who were very conservative. And the Republicans, even though they were by and large the party of business, they had liberal Republicans in the Northeast and in the Midwest who supported unions and who were very important, for example, in the passing of the Civil Rights Law. So what's happened since 1984, basically since Ronald Reagan was elected, is that the parties have polarized. And so there are no longer liberal Republicans. It's an extinct species. There are basically no longer conservative Democrats. Democrats in the South are now, the people who were the conservative Democrats have actually gone over to the Republican Party in the South. So, the people who were the segregationists are now in the Republican Party. And so that has presented some problems politically for unions, because it used to be easier for us if we could support both liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats who had the same agenda. We're now in a position where, not by any choice of our own, there's really not Republicans that we can support because they're taking such a hard right and such an anti-union and anti-civil rights sort of posture. So that creates difficulties for us, and then there are people, as a result of that, it kind of creates a vicious cycle. There are people who want to eliminate, for example, teachers' unions, because when you have elections, who are the major forces behind a progressive Democratic candidate? It's teachers' union. So then if you're a Republican and you're a conservative, you want to target teacher unions because they're supporting, your opponents. And a lot of the battles over the last 10 years have been precisely of that nature. And it has as much to do with what happens in the elections as it has to do with ideology. So that's why, I said, like in Wisconsin, the same folks who are passing the laws that make it more difficult for poor people and people of color, young people to vote, are the same people who are passing the laws that make it more difficult for unions to organize. And in both cases, they see it as a political reason because they see themselves having a shrinking natural base in American politics. American society has grown increasingly more diverse, more immigrants, and their view is that the only way that they can hold on to the politics they now have and be competitive is to strike at the base of support for the Democrats.
اگر بارها دنبال واژه آموزش گشته اید ولی با درهای بسته روبرو شده اید، اگر دنبال آموزشکده‌ای گشته اید که دور نباشد و استادهای خوبی هم داشته باشد، اگر مشتاق آموختن هستید اما توانایی مالی کافی نداشته اید که بیشتر و بیشتر بخوانید و بدانید، اگر شبها وقت آزاد دارید و روزها نمیتوانید دنبال درس و کلاس بروید، توانا بهترین انتخاب شماست. توانا بود هر که دانا بود. توانا رایگان در اختیار شماست. آموزشکده‌ای در خانه شماست. هر وقت که بخواهید، شب یا روز. با درس‌هایی مانند حق و حقوق زنان، دموکراسی، تفسیرهای نوین و لیبرال از دین، حقوق اقلیت‌ها، حکومت قانون، نهادسازی و نهادهای مدنی، محیط زیست، روزنامه نگاری و امنیت فضای مجازی و موبایل‌های هوشمند. آموزشکده توانا کلاس‌های دلخواه شما را رایگان به منزل شما می‌آورد. در کلاس‌های توانا با نام و جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. برای ما مهم انگیزه شهروندی و علاقه شما به آموختن است. ما هرگز نام واقعی شما را نمی‌پرسیم. تیم فنی توانا از طریق سایت تواناتک به شما کمک می‌کند تا با خیال راحت و فارغ از دردسرهای امنیت وب در کلاس‌ها شرکت کنید. در توانا بیاموزید، با تواناتک پاسخ سوال‌های فنی خود را بگیرید و از صدها کتاب، ویدئو، آدیو و مدرک دیجیتال در کتابخانه توانا رایگان استفاده کنید. توانا پنجره آشنایی شما با جهان ایده‌های نو و تجربه مردم دیگر کشورها در گذار به دموکراسی. برای دسترسی به توانا و اطلاعات بیشتر به فیسبوک، توییتر، یوتیوب و گوگل پلاس توانا و تواناتک بپیوندید.